The history books have lied to you about the American West.
They sold you a comfortable fable of clear battle lines. You were told stories of noble savages and heroic soldiers.
But the truth lies buried beneath the scorched desert sand.
The reality of this conflict was far colder and pragmatic.
We must strip away the romantic varnish to see clearly. The warriors of the high desert were not just fighting. They were dismantling the human mind of their opposing forces.
This was not a war of glory or honor.
It was a masterclass in absolute psychological dismantling and terror.
The vast landscape became a weapon in their capable hands.
Every rock and canyon served as a tool for fear. You believe you know how these battles were truly fought.
But you have never looked into the eyes of the abyss.
The myth paints them as spiritual guardians of the land. That narrative serves to soften the brutal reality of survival. The truth is that they were desperate men facing extinction.
They understood that a fair fight meant their certain death.
So they ensured that the fight was never, ever fair. They turned the geography itself into a theater of horror.
The silence of the desert became their most effective artillery. Soldiers reported feeling watched by eyes they could not see.
The paranoia was a poison that spread through the ranks. It dissolved discipline and broke the spirit of the invaders. This was asymmetric warfare, long before the term was invented. They were the original architects of the modern guerrilla insurgency.
To understand them, we must abandon our modern moral judgments.
We must look at the economics of their brutal trade. We must step into the shadows of the Sierra Madre Mountains. There, the only law was the law of the knife. The nightmare begins with the silence of the high desert. A column of blue-clad soldiers marches through the dusty heat. The sun beats down like a hammer on an anvil.
Their heavy wool uniforms are soaking with sweat and fear.
They scan the ridgelines for a silhouette against the sky. But the horizon remains empty, shimmering in the heat waves. This emptiness is more terrifying than a wall of enemies.
They know their adversary is close, watching their every move.
The unseen enemy transforms the landscape into a claustrophobic cage.
Every snap of a dry twig sounds like a gunshot. The soldiers are fighting a ghost that refuses to manifest. This psychological pressure cooker was crafted by design, not accident.
The indigenous strategists knew the value of the unknown threat. They let the imagination of the invader do the work.
A terrified soldier is half defeated before the first shot rings.
The commanders of the Federal machine were baffled and frustrated. They were trained for open fields and clear lines formations. They were prepared for a war that did not exist.
Instead, they found themselves chasing shadows across a burning hell.
The indigenous fighters utilized the terrain with supernatural proficiency.
They could vanish into a landscape that offered no cover.
They merged with the stone and the scrub brush seamlessly. This invisibility was not magic. It was a survival necessity. Created a legend that they were spirits, not men. That legend was a calculated piece of psychological warfare itself.
If your enemy believes you are a ghost, he falters. He hesitates at the critical moment of the violent engagement.
That split second of hesitation was usually the fatal margin.
The warriors capitalized on this fear with ruthless, surgical precision. They did not attack large columns with overwhelming force.
They picked off the stragglers and the careless scouts.
They struck when the enemy felt safe and finally relaxed.
This unpredictability kept the invading army in perpetual, exhausting tension.
Sleep became impossible for the men patrolling the borderlands. The sound of a coyote howling could mask a signal. The hoot of an owl might signal a coming death. They weaponized the natural sounds of the desert night.
The psychological toll was heavier than the physical casualties.
Officers reported men breaking down from the sheer, relentless stress. It was a war of nerves fought on the edge.
But behind this terror lay a cold, hard economic logic. We often ignore the resources required to sustain a resistance.
These raids were not just acts of vengeance or hate.
They were complex logistical operations designed for material gain. The warriors needed ammunition, horses, and food to survive.
Raiding parties were economic engines for their isolated people.
They stole livestock to feed families hiding in the mountains. They took weapons to continue the fight against superior numbers. The brutality of the raids served a dual, dark purpose.
It secured resources while terrifying the settlers into retreating.
Every burned ranch was a message written in fire.
It told the encroaching civilization that the price was high. The cost of expansion was paid in blood and terror. This was a strategy of deterrence, born from absolute desperation. The indigenous leaders were not mindless killers, as often portrayed.
They were pragmatic generals fighting a defensive war of attrition.
They knew they could not defeat the industrial federal machine. Their only hope was to make the occupation too costly.
They aimed to bleed the treasury and the public will.
It was a strategy that nearly worked for decades.
The press in the cities screamed for blood and resolution.
But the army could not catch what it could not see. The pursuit of these warriors became a national embarrassment.
Famous generals were humbled by bands of starving, desperate men.
The tactical genius of the Bedonkohe leader is legendary.
He moved his people like chess pieces across a board.
He used the international border as a strategic shield. He understood the bureaucratic limitations of his pursuing enemies. When the pressure was too high, he slipped into Mexico. He played two nations against each other with expert skill.
This was high-level geopolitical manipulation by a supposed savage. The federal commanders were forced to adopt the enemy's tactics. They hired indigenous scouts to hunt their own kind. And it was the only way to penetrate the invisible veil. They realized that only a wolf could catch a wolf.
This betrayal was the turning point in the long conflict.
It broke the psychological invincibility of the resistance leaders.
The knowledge that their own kin were tracking them hurt.
It sowed distrust and paranoia within the small fighting bands. The psychological weapon was finally turned against its creators.
But even in defeat, they maintained a grip on fear.
The final surrender was not a military conquest, really.
It was a negotiation born of exhaustion and dwindling resources. The warriors were not beaten on the field of battle. They were starved out and hunted until they could not run.
Yet, the legacy of their psychological warfare remains potent.
The myths we tell today are scars of that fear.
We romanticize them because we are no longer afraid.
But we must remember the gritty reality of the time. We must respect the terrifying intelligence of their resistance.
They forced the most powerful military to change its doctrine. They proved that the mind is the ultimate battlefield.
Their story is a lesson in the power of asymmetry.
It teaches us that fear is a currency in war.
As the war concluded, the true cost became apparent, not in the victories claimed, but in the unforgiving terrain where the final...
But the past whispers the truth to those who listen. They tell us that there was no glory in the canyon.
There was only the heat, the thirst, and the fear.
The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical wounds. The soldiers carried the silence of the desert home.
They could never forget the enemy they never truly saw.
The indigenous warriors had colonized the minds of their conquerors. That is the ultimate victory in the face of defeat. The ghost of the desert still haunts the American psyche.
We look at the empty horizon and feel a chill. We sense that something is watching us from the rocks. That is the enduring power of their psychological mastery. The history books give you dates and dry facts.
They do not give you the smell of the fear.
They do not explain the logic of the desperate violence.
You have to dig through the lies to find it. You have to be willing to see the darkness.
The warriors were not villains, and they were not heroes.
They were men pushed to the very edge of existence.
They looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back.
They used the darkness as a shield and a sword. And in doing so, they became masters of the mind. This is the story that the monuments will not tell. This is the narrative that does not fit the movies.
It is the raw, unpolished, and terrifying truth.
It is the story of how fear shaped a nation. And it is the story of the ultimate human endurance.